have the pleasure to support you as your moderator and co-host, together with my colleagues Andreas Vetter and Benjamin Kläuber, who will help in handling your questions if there are some. First of all, a big thank you to Director Susanne Reisinger-Anders for organizing this meeting in this new digital framing and for doing all the preparations. I may give you now quickly some important information to the setup of this meeting and introduce to you some basic functions of the Zoom meeting. First, I may point out that like in other business breakfasts, this meeting will be documented, which means in this case recorded. So your name and your video screen may appear in this recording. You would have the possibility to change or block it if you would not agree. Other important information: during the keynote of Dr. Malanik, I will mute, which means deactivate your microphone. You will see that in your taskbar on your side. After the speech, you will have the possibility to ask questions and to participate in the discussion. To do so, please raise first your hand. You can do this digital. You find in your taskbar, in most cases in the frame of your video pic, a symbol to raise your hand. And you can unmute, activate your microphone by your own by clicking the microphone symbol. If you cannot find it, I can also do that for you. And if you can't find the button to raise your hand, you can also physically raise your hand on the screen, and I hope that I or my colleague, Andreas, will see that. You have also the possibility to chat, which means to type messages to single participants or also to all participants, but please do that with a sense of proportion. And if somebody still has a technical question, please send me a message in the chat room. So I hope everything is all right. I wish you a pleasant and informative AmCham Talks business breakfast, and may hand over to President Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Marcin. So welcome in my name, in the name of the American Chamber of Commerce, to all of you. Honestly, it's really good to see you all again, even if it's just through a small window on my computer screen. We would love to see you all in person, but unusual times require unusual new approaches, and we are doing this. Thank you so much for keeping in touch with us and to participate today in our AmCham Talks series. I hope you have at least the same perfect breakfast served to you at your home as we normally have in Hilton Vienna Plaza. If not, don't worry, times will change again, and for sure to the better, and to personal meetings in the future, for sure. The AmCham office is fully operable currently. Our office has implemented the working shift operation mode, working from home and from the office, but we are fully reachable and in full operation. Flexibility and creativity is our best companion currently, and I want to thank Susanne and the team for their flexibility and really great attitude in difficult times. As already communicated to you per email in our latest newsletter, it is my pleasure to congratulate once more Susanne Reisinger-Anders for her promotion to Executive Director of the AmCham Austria. Once again, Susanne, you are with us today. I see clapping hands already. Thank you very much. Well deserved. And I really appreciate working with you. At the same time, I want to thank Daniela Hohmann for 13 years of excellent services for the AmCham. And I wish her all the best for all the things that are upcoming in the years ahead. For sure, she would have expected a different kind of a kickstart in her new quality of life cycle, but this we cannot change. But she is well, and we wish her, of course, all the best for her. We have adapted the AmCham Talks format quickly to the situation, and you are today witness the world premiere of an AmCham Talk via a Zoom conference. We have now 50 people participating. It's great to see you all, and it's great to have such an honorable and profound expert speaking to us today. And I want to warmly welcome Mr. Dr. Peter Malanik in our round. Dr. Malanik is a profound expert in aviation industry in general and also in the airline industry. He has over 27 years experience in leading positions in the airline industry, summiting as joint CEO for Austrian Airlines in Austria. He holds an LLD degree in law, and of course he is Austrian by nature. Dr. Malanik is the president of the Austrian Aviation Association. He is also chairman of the supervisory board of the Flughafen Klagenfurt, and he is lecturer at different universities like the WU in Vienna, or very near to my heart, the Danube University in Krems. So thank you, Dr. Malanik, for joining us today and giving us your keynote around the development and importance of the regional aviation industry for trends and opportunities in this specific sector of the industry. For the US, for example, it's also extremely important to have this regional aviation industry working, because in the end, it's somehow the last mile. When coming to Europe, you need a regional, typically carrier to get to your final destination. So that's why the things are connected and really, really important. With this, I want to warmly welcome again Dr. Peter Malanik at our AmCham Talk, and would like to hand over to him to give us his keynote. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Yes, the topic for today's talk was decided several weeks or months ago, I would say, and at that time no one would have expected what might happen surrounding the coronavirus crisis in not only in Europe but worldwide. So the topic of today's presentation, the future of European, or the future of regional air traffic, might look as if it a little bit falls out of the present situation and is a bit awkward to talk about the future of regional air traffic in such an environment. But actually it is not really. It really makes sense to look at that, but nevertheless, the first thing I'd like to do today is to give you some facts and figures about coronavirus, the coronavirus crisis, and aviation at large. Then how comes, give an answer to the question, how comes that the American Chamber of Commerce really cares about regional air transport, and why am I here today talking about that? Does that make sense for such a global organization, institution that looks across the Atlantic and not at the tiny little last mile, as Mr. Winkler has rightly put out, that regional air traffic is providing? And then I'd like to line out three propositions or hypotheses, as you will. Regional air transport is a business with small aircraft at small airports, but it's not small business. And the consolidation in the aviation industry that will unavoidably follow the corona crisis will open up even more niches for regional air traffic. That's one. Two, as many would expect, no, high-speed rail trains or railways will not kill regional air traffic, and I'll try to explain why. And then thirdly, some smart regional airports will turn into vertically integrated aviation systems and thereby set the tone for a completely new outfit for regional aviation. Now let me start with the first messages, and there I'm going to throw some impressive or rather depressing figures at you to start with. Currently, 13,500 commercial aircraft worldwide are grounded. That is more than half of the entire commercial world aircraft fleet. if we make some assumptions, some very rough assumptions, and of course one cannot be precise here, but if we make some very rough assumptions on the average value of those aircraft grounded currently, this means that assets worth something between 700 billion and 1,000 billion US dollars are on ground unproductively. This is quite impressive. But it's even worse, because those aircraft that are still flying are either cargo aircraft, or if they are passenger aircraft, they are largely empty. Because revenue passenger kilometers, that's how many passengers, how many revenue passengers fly how many kilometers, is down by 82% globally, 82%. So in a sense, world aviation is close to a complete standstill. Those figures, by the way, come from IATA, and IATA also gives a prognosis that airlines worldwide will lose about 314 billion US dollars in revenue in 2020. And that's if things go well from now on. A couple of weeks ago, that was 250 million. Again, some weeks ago, that was 136 million. So IATA is correcting its projections for recovery of the airline industry on a more or less weekly basis. And as I say, those 314 billion US dollars in 2020 is if things from now on get better. This is half of all the revenues of that airlines worldwide were expecting, but European airlines will hit worse than other airlines around the world for various reasons. And let me add, the typical airline has cash to cover about 2 months of revenues, 2 months. But now airlines are losing half of their revenues. So it's no surprise that Lufthansa yesterday announced that it would need roughly 10 billion euros to survive, and is currently losing 1 million euros every hour. Every hour. Now, also no surprise that the share price of airlines has lost 34% within 1 month, less in the Asia-Pacific region, in Europe more, and US airlines shares have lost about exactly that number of 34%. Whilst at the same time, the global corporate FTSE lost 14%. So airlines more than twice, airline share price more than twice as much. IATA projects that the recovery will begin in the third quarter of 2020, first in the domestic aviation sector, so that revenue passenger kilometers, you remember this measurement for how many passengers fly how many kilometers. The revenue passenger kilometers in the third quarter of 2020 will be down by 60% only in the third quarter, and IATA will see international aviation slowly coming back in the fourth quarter with a minus of 50% revenue passenger kilometers. 2021 will still be some 30% below 2019, and 2019 levels will only be reached in 2023. Now, this is the longest crisis and by far the deepest that aviation has seen since its existence. And the question is how aviation will come out from this crisis. Europe, again, I'm convinced will be hit worst. Other regions in the world have a tradition and will keep up with that tradition to support their aviation industry faster and with less conditions attached than Europe is probably going to do. So not only is Europe the center of the coronavirus crisis at this point in time, but European governments, European institutions also do not have the same, shall I say, tradition to support aviation industry as a major factor in the quality of the economic centers that they have established nationally. Now, if one listens to those figures, one might come to the conclusion that the rest of my presentation, the future of regional aviation, might be pretty short, Because if we listen to those figures or look at the prospects for aviation, then one might quickly jump to the conclusion that there simply is no future for regional aviation. And that might therefore conclude my presentation. But no, of course, that is not the case. I'm quite convinced that there is a future for regional aviation, and the regional aviation future is perhaps not that gloomy as one might expect given the current situation. And I'm going to explain in a few minutes why. But I also want to come back to the question that Mr. Winkler raised in the beginning. Why would the American Chamber of Commerce care at all about those regional air traffic issues being a transatlantic and global institution? One might say that those quirky small propeller aircraft flying between some provincial cities has nothing to do with the much bigger picture the American Chamber of Commerce normally deals with. But that's also not true. Because for regional aviation essentially does two things. One is connecting the respective region to the usually closest center, mostly the national capital of that country where that region is located, and linking the region to the world by connecting to hub airports. Now, guess what is more important? The connection to the national center or connecting the region to the world? Let me give you an example here. Klagenfurt is connected to Vienna, undoubtedly. And 12% of all passengers flying between Vienna and Klagenfurt are point-to-point passengers flying between Vienna and Klagenfurt. The rest, 88%, connects in Vienna to the world, amongst many other destinations to the United States. A large number of those people flying from Klagenfurt to Vienna do that because actually they want to fly to New York or Chicago or Washington or to other destinations in the US. So those regional airports are the door to the world for the regions. And the first mile or the last mile, wherever you look at, however you look at it, or whatever direction you look at it, for that connection to the world is the regional airport and the regional airline connecting that airport to the center. Now, you may also ask, well, is the Klagenfurt situation not specifically different from others? Isn't that 12% flying on aircraft from Klagenfurt to Vienna and staying in Vienna, isn't that an exceptionally low percentage? And the answer may be surprising. No, it's not a low percentage. It's actually a comparably high percentage. Airports like, for instance, Linz or Graz have an even much lower percentage of people flying point to point between the respective destination and Vienna. And the same goes for other regional airports in Germany, in France, etc., etc. Situation may be a little bit different in countries like Sweden, Norway, Finland, where regions are so distant and so badly connected with other modes of transport to their national centers that the percentage of point-to-point traffic at those destinations is probably higher, but still the percentage contributing to international traffic is extremely important, is extremely high, and is adding a lot to the quality of the economic and commercial centers in the regions, without which probably many companies, many enterprises that have production sites or even administration centers in the regions would most probably not be there if they wouldn't have that connection to the world. This leads me to the first assertion or hypothesis or proposal that I'd like to make. Regional air transport, as I said, is business with small aircraft at small airports, but it is not small business. Let's look at some figures here as well. Half of airline passengers worldwide are flying sectors below 500 nautical miles, that's less than 1,000 kilometers, and 30% are flying sectors below 300 nautical miles, that's a little bit more than 500 kilometers. 30% below 300 nautical miles, 50% below 500 nautical miles. That is a study done by the European Regional Airlines Association. This study is not brand new, admittedly, it's about 5 years old, but still I'm quite convinced that those figures have not changed dramatically. In Europe alone, there are some 900 regional aircraft in operation, half of which are small and medium-sized jets. We're not talking about those, as I say, quirky small turboprop aircraft only. We're talking about real aircraft like Embraer or Airbus A220 jet aircraft with something like 100, 110, 120 seats. Believe it or not, we have some 270 regional airports in Europe, 220. And we have at least 61 regional airlines in Europe. I say at least because the number is constantly changing. Some are coming, some are going. So it's difficult to keep an oversight. But there are something like 60 plus minus regional airlines in Europe. So we are talking about anything but a niche market here. 900 aircraft, 270 regional airports, 60 regional airlines. Now, does that add anything to the economic welfare? There is a study done by the German Institute for Transport Science in Münster on Dortmund Airport. Now, okay, Dortmund Airport amongst regional airports is not the smallest one. It has something like 3 million passengers every year. So amongst regional airports, that's a biggie. That's a big airport among regional airports. But still, Dortmund Airport is only 70 kilometers away from Düsseldorf, much, much smaller airport, Düsseldorf. So one might think, well, if it's so close to a much larger airport, the economic benefit of Dortmund Airport is probably not enormous. And probably the airport is not highly profitable. Now, this study done by the Institute of Transport Science found out that the economic contribution, the value added by Dortmund Airport to the immediate region around Dortmund is about 300 million euros every year. That's not bad. Even if the airport was not profitable, which I don't know whether it is, even if the airport needs to be supported locally, it is still a very good investment to keep that airport up and running. So again, until Corona strangled aviation, regional aviation was a sizable part of global aviation, the last mile, and an important asset for a region to have a regional airport and to be connected to the centers of the world. It is an essential feeder to intercontinental traffic, and without that feeding, many intercontinental routes would not be profitable and therefore might not be operated at all. What does that mean? In order to fly from Vienna to, say, Washington or Chicago, you need a lot of passengers that come from other regions than the immediate surroundings of Vienna. If those people would not come to Vienna, they might go to Frankfurt, they might go to other Zurich or other bigger airports to fly to the United States. But it is regional air transport that brings those people to Vienna. Some part of that regional air transport is operated by Austrian Airlines themselves. Some other parts are operated by other regional airlines, but it is essential to fill planes. And with the local traffic that is not fed from smaller regions into Vienna, I would suggest that most long-haul destinations out of Vienna would not be operated, and many destinations to typical business destinations in Central Eastern Europe would equally not be operated. So the feed is essential. Now, the second part of my first hypothesis, regional air traffic is not small business, is that the post-corona consolidation will make more room for regional aviation and regional airlines. Now that may also come as a surprise, because if there is consolidation, then one would expect that airlines will shrink and the smaller airlines will be hit worse. That may not be entirely correct, because undoubtedly Corona will force all airlines to cut costs dramatically. That will also lead to a reduction in number of aircraft operated. We've heard some some figures about Austrian to be reduced by 1/5 or even 1/4. Lufthansa will put aircraft on ground and not operate them anymore. Regional airlines will most likely, medium-sized airlines will most probably be consolidated into larger groups of airlines or might even leave the market. By the way, there is one specific element in aviation about leaving the market. Unlike in many other businesses, the fact that an airline is going bankrupt and leaves the market does not reduce capacity automatically, because those assets of airlines, even if they go bankrupt, are of course extremely mobile because they are aircraft. And mobile assets are quickly moved somewhere else. Aircraft are repossessed by leasing companies. Leasing companies will try to market them. And if they can't market them, they will put aircraft somewhere into the desert in the US to keep them conserved, but ready to fly as soon as possible. So capacity in aviation hardly ever goes away. It's just operated by someone else. And this is one of the reasons why there is a tendency in aviation, not only in regional aviation, but aviation at large, that there is a tendency to always have some overcapacity in place, which is not eliminated by market exits or bankruptcies of airlines. On the contrary, there's even a contrary effect. Aircraft that go back to leasing companies or are put in storage somewhere in the desert will reduce the value of new and used aircraft in operation, because there is capacity that is ready to fly at any time that someone needs it, and that will be marketed by leasing companies globally to go back in operation. And since there are many in storage, probably in the very near future, the value of aircraft will go down. Firstly, the value of used aircraft, and secondly, the value of new aircraft just as much, because the balance between acquiring a new aircraft, which is quite costly, or flying a used aircraft that is really cheap because it's stored somewhere in the desert, if that difference gets too big, no one is buying new aircraft anymore. Everyone is buying older aircraft. And by the way, it's not good for the environment, because clearly older aircraft are less fuel efficient than newer aircraft. So those stored aircraft put on pressure on the global aircraft market. And they also put pressure on balance sheets of airlines. Because if you have, say, 100 aircraft operating, and those 100 aircraft are part of your balance sheet at a certain value, and the aircraft value on the worldwide, the global aircraft market is going down dramatically, your chartered accountant will sooner or later ask you if you don't have to devalue or impair the value of your aircraft in your balance sheet. And that may put an additional stress on the already stressed airlines globally. But coming back to the point, these low prices for used aircraft will have another effect, and that is it will be cheaper to set up a new airline, because getting aircraft is one of the most costly hurdles to establish an airline. Now, if aircraft momentarily are really cheap, and will get even cheaper because there are so many aircraft grounded and stored somewhere in the desert, if that is the case, aircraft prices will go down, and the business case for setting up an airline will be much, much easier to be made than in a situation when aircraft are expensive. So therefore, we have this effect. Aircraft are getting cheaper, be that used aircraft or new aircraft. Second effect, consolidation leads to a situation where larger groupings will focus on their core markets. They will focus on trunk routes. They will start operations on the most important destinations. And the most important destinations will not in the first place be regional destinations. Yes, sooner or later they will need the feed from regional destinations, as I mentioned just before, but that will not be the first, not the second, not even the third step to re-establish aviation again. And that means there will be a lot of room for regional aviation to fill niches that are left by the big airlines and the consolidated airlines after the corona crisis, which the big groupings like the Lufthansas and British Airwayses and Air Frances in Europe will most likely not fill immediately and perhaps not even in the nearer future. So, as I say, many destinations with lower passenger volume will be abandoned for a while, disconnected for a while, and that will open up opportunities for small airlines and even for some small startup carriers who have no burdens from cost burdens from their past, because legacy costs that come from from years of operation, decades of operation in airlines is one of the biggest problems of legacy carriers, and newly established airlines have much less of that. So I'm quite convinced regional aviation will come back. At the moment, regional aviation is just as much grounded as global aviation, but I'm quite convinced it will come back. Okay, we have 2 new participants, and some regional airlines will even profit from the coming back of the void that some consolidation will have left. Now, there is one assertion that is constantly repeated, and that is high-speed trains will undoubtedly kill regional aviation. That's the end of regional aviation, because high-speed trains are so much more capable of providing the transport that regional airlines or regional air traffic is providing at the moment. Well, I'm not quite convinced about that. Regions need connections to the world, and to some point, and some point-to-point destinations as well. In order to have those connections, regions need 2, perhaps 3 connections to a hub center per day in order to meet all the waves of aircraft leaving that hub airport. In the case of Vienna, 3 daily flights might be sufficient to reach practically all destinations in both directions that Austrian Airlines is offering at that hub airport in Vienna. Now, if you look at a high-speed train has something between 350 and 500 seats. And to build a track for a high-speed train for, say, 400 kilometers distance costs, of course, depending on topography, about 10 billion euros. And that is without acquiring the land that is needed to build that high-speed railway track. If one invests that much money, you better use that infrastructure that you're building quite extensively. So a train every hour will probably be necessary, at least, to use that infrastructure built for a high-speed railway. That means that a high-speed connection dumps about approximately 5,000 seats per day and direction on a connection where this train is running. Clearly, there are stops in between, but if you add too many stops in between, then it's not a high-speed train anymore. It's a slow-speed Bummelzug, as one would say in German. So you must not have too many stops in between. You may not connect too many regions with one high-speed rail connection, because otherwise, as I say, it's not a high-speed connection anymore. So you're adding a lot of seats for relatively small destinations if you're connecting smaller regions to hub airports. Then, of course, there will be some other transport modes replaced by the high-speed connection. There will be less people driving a car. There will be most people who are using the train now will jump on the high-speed train, undoubtedly. But all that will probably not fill more those 5,000 seats that a smaller region will be connected with to the larger region. That means high-speed trains will rather be an excellent option to connect larger centers rather than to connect smaller centers and regions to a larger center, because the capacity needed for people to connect to the world at larger centers can be covered by regional aircraft at a much, much smaller scale than with high-speed railways. And then conveniently, one and the same regional airport infrastructure can be used for many different destinations, whilst the high-speed track is the high-speed track and it always goes to the same destination. Even more conveniently, aircraft used for connecting that region to the hub can also be used for connecting that region on weekends or at different seasons to other destinations, which may be more important on weekends or at in different seasons than the center. So using regional airport infrastructure and regional airlines to connect smaller regions to centers, to the world, and to even holiday destinations is a much, much more appropriate way to do that, because first, the infrastructure is already here, 270 regional airports globally. No, sorry, not globally, in Europe. And secondly, with that existing infrastructure, it is possible to connect on a relatively small scale regions to centers and via centers to the world. So therefore, yes, high-speed trains will take a part of the traffic that is currently flying in Europe, but it is probably taking more of the traffic flying on trunk routes than of the traffic flying on regional destinations. Trunk routes, by definition, are not regional, typical markets for regional air transport. Now, my last point on the future of regional air transport. Undoubtedly, growth is an issue in regional air traffic. Markets do grow, but they grow at a relatively slow speed. We've seen a growth of roughly 8% over 3 years recently. Air transport in general grows about, well, not twice as much, but 50% more than regional air traffic is growing. Now, 8% in 3 years is nice growth, but it's not much. Still, growth is needed to keep cost down, because without growth, cost is constantly growing. Without growth, one cannot offset the cost, the growing cost basis that airlines and airports are having for labor cost and all the other cost factors. And growth can offset part of those cost increases, efficiency, of course, as well, but also other costs that are growing and that cannot be easily controlled by efficiencies. So therefore, regional airlines need to grow as much as most other businesses need to grow to keep their cost basis within a reasonable percentage. And also because the average price that passengers are paying for a ticket has been decreasing over the last couple of years. From 2011 to today, the ticket price, the average revenue from one ticket has decreased from an index 100 in 2011 to an index of 65 today. So that's 1/3 less, and that does not take into account inflation. This is a trend that has been there for decades, and airlines have adapted to that trend by increasing efficiency, by bringing costs down, by buying more efficient aircraft that use less fuel, but also by growth. And regional air transport needs to grow as well, to go at the same pace with the other sectors of the aviation industry. With one advantage: regional aviation produces higher ticket prices than, shall I say, the rest of the aviation industry. Because regional air transport, if it is point-to-point, is transport that is essential, that is needed, that someone is flying not as a sort of discretionary travel, because it's just cheap, let's go to. No, it is transport that is essential and needed to connect to the administrative center, for instance, in Vienna. And those people who fly from, say, Klagenfurt to Vienna do that because they have a compelling reason to do so. Yes, there are a few people who say, well, let's go to Vienna for a dinner, but the number of those people are very, very, very limited. There are much, much more people who would take such a decision to fly to Barcelona, to Rome, to London, whatever, but very few people would apply the same logic to a flight from Klagenfurt to Vienna. So the number of those people who are flying on those destinations have a compelling reason to do so. And because they have a compelling reason to do so, the average yield, the average revenue from a ticket is comparably high when one looks at point-to-point traffic. It's a different story when we look at transfer traffic, but let's leave that away for a minute because that gets a little bit too complicated. Let me get back to growth. Growth is important for regional airlines. Growth is limited. So there is an option to grow if one is probably not in the position to grow quickly horizontally. There is an option to grow vertically. And I'm seeing more and more experiments of regional airports to consider vertical integration by setting up their own airline, by setting up their own maintenance base, perhaps even have own tower services with using new technology like remote tower technology and other elements, like putting together the whole value chain of aviation at one regional airport. Clearly, that's risky because that means putting all eggs into one basket. Clearly, that's risky because all those elements of a vertical integration, as is always the case with vertical integrations, all those elements of a vertical integration bear the same risk, because if aviation goes down, then all elements of the value chain go down. If one diversifies to other industries, that there might be some risk hedging included. But and vertical integration hardly has that element of risk hedging as part of its logic. But still, it is an option for airports to keep alive in the post-corona situation, first of all, to grow into new businesses, into vertically integrated businesses, and to support themselves by participating at all elements of the value chain in aviation. That is a situation that we are seeing at some smart regional airports at the moment. Different concepts are evaluated at the moment. We see that in Bern, we see that in Rostock, we see that in Bozen. There are some ideas surrounding such a concept in Klagenfurt, etc., etc. I think as adventurous as that may seem right at the beginning, as convincing it is when one looks closer to it. And by the way, vertical integration in aviation seems to make sense from the smallest to the biggest scale, from the smallest thinkable to the very biggest thinkable scale. Look at, for instance, at People's in Altenrhein. That's perhaps the smallest possible end, a very, very small airport, an airline with one aircraft running one route, and it seems to work because otherwise it wouldn't be there anymore. Up to the biggest scale that one can think about, and that's the Gulf carriers. Fully integrated airport, airline, air traffic control, catering, handling, technical services, everything integrated in one value chain. And that's the biggest scale you can think of in aviation. So vertical integration is something that has no tradition in aviation. We all consider it as a given that an airport and an airline are not in the same hands, whilst we equally consider it as a given that railway tracks and railway companies are sort of part of the same company. Of course, recently a little bit separated, but still the same company. Railway has infrastructure and the railway companies traditionally in one hand. It's going to split a little bit. Aviation never had infrastructure and operation in one hand. Perhaps this vertical integration gives a good opportunity for regions, for regional airports and regional airports to grow vertically and to re-establish themselves as fully integrated local regional aviation systems. Thank you very much. So, can we have the moderator back?
Yes.
Yes.
Very interesting information. Maybe would you like to moderate the questions, President Winkler, or should I do that now?
Please do it from your side, but I would vote for the first question, please.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Malanik. Very interesting insights. One question in my head is, do you foresee a different hit of the corona crisis and its consequences to the classical national carriers and the so-called low-cost and private carriers? Because you said in the beginning that Lufthansa, they expect 10 billion they need from the state. Austrian Airlines, the number is around 800. They put, at least it said, but a private air carrier, I think, is in a little bit different position with this situation, right?
Right. Now, that's a question that is quite pertinent at the moment, and therefore some journalists have been asking that question recently as well. First, of course, Lufthansa is also a private airline with no state ownership, at least at this point in time. It is just as private as Ryanair is. It just applies a completely different business model. Now, which business model is worse hit than the other? Predicting the future is obviously always quite difficult, and it's looking a little bit into the crystal ball. And I must say, looking into the crystal ball has never been so blurred as it is today. But still, I try to answer the question. Legacy carriers, let's put it that way, legacy carriers that are around for a long time, they carry with them a lot of burdens of the past, cost burdens of the past, and they run a very complex business model. So they are, first of all, badly hit by the crisis, but they have relatively few reserves and relatively little cash at hand. Cash flow in a legacy airline is really a strong flow. Cash flows in, cash flows out quite quickly. And if that flow is interrupted on the inflow side, the outflow is still quite considerable. Newly established airlines in the business model of low-cost carriers have a totally different situation. They grew quickly. They don't have the burdens of the past. Mr. O'Leary, the CEO of Ryanair, always is quite outspoken on the need to keep costs down at all cost. Yeah? Whatever it takes, keep costs down. Mr. Varadi of Wizz Air has the same attitude. The only thing that's interesting in running an airline is to be the cheapest. Everything else is not so important, because if you are the cheapest, revenues will come in anyhow. That's the basis of the low-cost airline business model that works well. And the low-cost business model has, over the last years, produced very good returns if you do it right. There are some cases where airlines didn't do it right and they went bankrupt. But if you do it right, if you stick to the pure concept of low cost, ultra low cost carriers, then it works nicely. It produces a lot of revenues, and those airlines have accumulated in the meantime a good cash box of cash reserves. Mr. O'Leary yesterday said, maybe true or not, but he said he has about 4 billion euros cash reserves. That is far more than Lufthansa has. So he says, I just need to wait. Yeah? We are surviving everything longer than others. That may be true. That speaks a lot in favor of the low-cost carriers surviving the crisis better than others. What speaks against them? Because there are also two important elements that speak against them. One is that clearly network airlines are more important to the overall economy than low-cost carriers. Because low-cost carriers are addressing, in the first place, a sort of discretionary traffic. Traffic that may fly or may not. Traffic that flies for leisure, and sometimes there's also some business people using them. But primarily the focus is discretionary traffic that may happen or may not happen. Legacy airlines or network airlines are providing a network, are providing quality to a destination, to a region, to reach the world from that region. Low-cost carriers, by definition, would normally not do that. They have a different market. They fly to attractive destination where they can generate a lot of traffic by applying low prices. Now, how low does a price have to be for masses to fly to one completely unknown destination somewhere in Central Asia? Probably difficult. And that's why low-cost carriers are not flying to those destinations, because it's not their business model. When it comes to the second difficulty, it is interesting to predict how people will react after the corona crisis is over. Will people still be afraid of traveling generally because they are afraid of their health? Or will that go away quite quickly and people are forgetting easily? That is a question that is unanswered, and I don't have an answer myself. I don't think that people will be afraid for a very long time, but for some time, yes. Secondly, we are running into a big recession, and many people will lose their jobs, will lose their income, and will be concerned about their economic future. That is no good news for low-cost carriers, because traveling to, say, Barcelona because it's just cheap doesn't mean that the whole trip is just cheap. You will spend a lot of money on that weekend in Barcelona. And the flight is perhaps the smallest part of it, but still you spend a lot of money. Will you do that still when you just lost your job, when you are concerned about paying your bills? Will, in other words, the price elasticity that is the essential ingredient for low-cost carriers to carry the masses, will the price elasticity for a big part of the people after Corona crisis and within the recession and hopefully not depression after Corona, will that price elasticity still be there to the same extent? I have a big question mark here. So that's, some things are speaking in favor of low-cost carriers, that they will come out better than network airlines, but it's those two big question marks that might be detrimental for low-cost carriers, more than for established hub carriers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions or remarks? Not so far.
I would go for a second question.
Yes.
In terms of green energy and these kind of things, do you foresee changes in alternative power engine at airplanes or different concepts using renewable resources? Because I don't read that much on airplanes and airline industry. Do you foresee this for the future?
very good question indeed, and that is something that is very close to my heart, because one reads very little about, as you say, about new technologies that may be a big game changer in the CO2 emission of aviation. One hears or reads a little bit about electric aircraft powered by batteries. Now that may work in the immediate short distances between an airport and the downtown location, perhaps. And perhaps that's even a good idea, but that is distances that at this point in time are not flown at all. So that doesn't replace anything. Maybe it adds, it doesn't replace anything. Battery-powered aircraft for longer distances, I don't see for a very, very long while, because there are a lot of requirements for batteries in aircraft for safety reasons that you don't have to fulfill in, for instance, a Tesla, because batteries have an unfortunate tendency to burn easily. We see that, and then are very difficult to extinguish, much more difficult to extinguish than kerosene. Battery fires are the most difficult to extinguish. Kerosene fires are quite easy, because kerosene actually doesn't burn easily. Now, if one would fit aircraft with batteries that are safe in an aircraft, the energy density of those batteries is about 80 times less than kerosene. So in other words, the same energy that is in 1 kilogram kerosene is in 80 kilograms of battery. And that will not work, not in the foreseeable future. Batteries will have to become 80 times better than they are today. I don't foresee that. But there are other options. There are other options, and that is hydrogen on the one hand. Bit difficult in aircraft as well, because it needs pressurized tanks, and hydrogen is also highly explosive. And since the Hindenburg disaster in the 30s, hydrogen has a relatively bad reputation in aviation. But there are other ways, and that is synthetic fuels. Synthetic fuels are approximately 3 to 4 times more expensive than current kerosene, but improving. So if we have, at the one hand, batteries that need to improve 80 times, or synthetic fuels that need to improve 3 or 4 times, I would know where to invest and where to support, which technology to support. So the technology physically and chemically is available. Production has not started yet, but could start the minute one establishes a number of production sites. And then depending on how much CO2 emissions one would want to achieve, fuels will be a little bit more expensive or 3 or 4 times more expensive if the CO2 emissions of those synthetic fuels should really be zero, which is possible, but more expensive. So yes, I foresee some big progress to be made very soon, but it's not the direction towards electric flying. It's if we want to make big progress, then we need to go the way of synthetic fuels.
Thank you very much. As I could see there, yes, Mrs. Thun, please.
Thank you very much. I was just mentioning, I mean, it's at the moment irrelevant, but will come within the next few months. The first thing is, how do you think that airlines will deal with social distancing? I mean, you can't leave out every second place. You can't fill only every second row. I mean, that will be for this year probably a very big issue.
Indeed, indeed. Big issue for the immediate future. If we're getting aircraft back in the air, we need to have an answer exactly for that question. And as you say, if you leave open every second seat, then probably we will not get aircraft back into the air because it will be highly unprofitable to fly. Yeah? And secondly, it doesn't help because the distance between seat rows is below 1 meter. So you may have the passenger sitting at your side at 1 meter distance, but the passenger sitting exactly in front of you will still be closer than the 1 meter, most likely. And probably that is the more problematic distance, because when you're coughing, you're throwing straight and not to the side, right? If you get the point. So that's not an option. What else could we do? Well, at the moment, airlines associations, also like the Austrian Aviation Association, are thinking about things that could be done. The very obvious thing is wearing masks in aircraft, everyone during the entire flight. That's an obvious thing. The next thing is to sanitize aircraft after landing, so that smear infections will not happen. That's also an obvious thing. But there must be more than that, and we are thinking about concepts to help aviation back and reduce the risk of infections within aircraft. By the way, there is one thing that is important, because there's big misperception. The air condition in aircraft is not a source of infection. The air that's coming out of the air condition is the cleanest you can think of. It's just as clean as the air that comes out in surgery rooms in hospitals, because the filters in aircraft are HEPA filters that filter out every viruses just as good as hospitals filter out viruses in their surgery rooms. So the air condition that is perceived very often as a source of virus infections is not. It is much more dangerous that there are smear infections on the table of the seat in front of you than the air that comes out of the air condition. And big part of the air that comes out of the air condition is so-called bleed air that is brought in from the outside, even while the aircraft is flying. So it's fresh air from the outside.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. There's some more questions.
Yeah, I see one question in the chat. I think I read it. And the question would be on cargo aircraft. Will they become a stronger role on the global market?
I would think so. Cargo aircraft are the last ones flying. Yeah? They are quite important in bringing essential goods, be that masks, be that protective devices, be that medicine, everything that are needed in all situations. And we see now how important air cargo is generally, but also particularly in a crisis. I recently talked to the CEO of Lufthansa Cargo, and he said, well, prices for cargo has tripled recently. So the demand is extremely high. And we've been talking a lot about passenger aircraft and passenger airlines. I think cargo airlines will be much stronger after the crisis than they have been before.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, then I may hand over again to President Winkler.
If I may, I've just seen popping up one question regarding those plexiglass separations. Seats. Someone may have had that question, and a quick answer to that. I don't see that happening. Why? Because however you would design those glass walls or plastic walls between passengers, it will certainly hamper evacuation of aircraft. And that is an absolute no-go. An aircraft needs to be evacuated in 2 minutes. And if there is all sorts of plexiglass flying around the aircraft after a crash, or a hard landing, this will not enable us to evacuate an aircraft in the required time. And I don't see authorities to allow for longer evacuation times in case of an accident, one thing. And second thing, everything that goes into an aircraft and is fixed in an aircraft, even a device to store your mobile phone somewhere in the cockpit, all that needs to be certified. And certification in aviation takes just as long as certification in the pharmaceutical industry takes. So, or even longer. So in order for those plexiglass separations, for those plastic separations to be even from a certification point of view allowed to be installed in aircraft, I would hope that we have the Corona crisis long behind us.
Thank you, Dr. Malanik. Well, some more questions? I think not. And thank you very much on this really informative and relevant words and information. I may hand over to President Winkler for closing remarks and words.
Yeah, thank you very much. So first and foremost, thank you, Dr. Malanik, for this great insight and your keynote. It was really a pleasure to have you here at AmCham Talks. We wish you personally all the best health and stay safety.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
To the full audience, the next AmCham Talk is already scheduled, and it's really my pleasure to announce that we will have for sure the next AmCham Talk on the 29th of May. Again, in Zoom format, our guest will be Magister Maria Zesch. She is Chief Commercial Officer at Magenta, an industry which is more relevant and critical than ever before in these times to keeping up telecommunications and the internet alive for all of us. And we are very much looking forward to host Magister Zesch in our AmCham Talks. Thank you all for joining. I hope you had an interesting time and breakfast with us. We wish you all the best, especially health and safetiness for you personally. And we hope to see you all again latest 29th of May. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.